My name is Olivia Carter, and for most of my life, I was the daughter my parents treated like a backup plan. Not a dream, not an investment, not a future success story, just a backup plan. The kind of daughter who was expected to be polite, helpful, and invisible. The kind of daughter whose achievements were acknowledged with a smile and forgotten by dinner. The kind of daughter who was constantly compared to her older brother and somehow always came up short. Looking back now, I realize the signs were there from the beginning. But when you're a child, you don't notice favoritism. You call it normal. You assume every family works the same way. You assume every little girl grows up watching her brother receive things she has to earn. You assume every daughter learns to shrink herself so her family's favorite child can shine. I learned that lesson early. I was 7 years old when my brother Matthew got his first bicycle. A beautiful blue mountain bike with shiny chrome handlebars and thick tires. I still remember the excitement on his face. Our parents stood in the driveway smiling proudly while he rode circles around the neighborhood. 3 months later, my birthday arrived. I secretly hoped for a bicycle too, not because I wanted something expensive. I simply wanted to feel equally important. Instead, I received a second-hand dollhouse from a garage sale. The paint was chipped. One of the doors was missing. My mother smiled and told me how lucky I was, and because I was 7 years old, I smiled back and thanked her. That was the first time I remember feeling it. That strange feeling. The feeling that somehow my brother and I were living under different rules. As we grew older, those differences became impossible to ignore. Matthew's mistakes were accidents. Mine were disappointments. Matthew forgot his homework. Everyone forgets sometimes. I forgot mine. You need to be more responsible. Matthew got a C on a test. School isn't everything. I got an A-. You could have done better. No matter what happened, the outcome was always the same. The standards moved, the expectations changed, and somehow my brother always remained the hero of the story. By the time I reached high school, I had stopped expecting fairness. Instead, I focused on achievement. If I couldn't earn equal treatment, maybe I could earn respect. At least that was what I told myself. I joined academic clubs. I volunteered after school. I worked harder than anyone I knew. While other teenagers spent weekends at parties, I spent mine studying. While my friends worried about dances and football games, I worried about scholarships and college applications. Because deep down, I believed education would change everything. I believed success would finally make my parents see me. I believed achievement would force them to acknowledge my worth. I couldn't have been more wrong. Matthew, meanwhile, lived an entirely different life. He was charismatic, popular, confident, the type of person who could walk into any room and instantly become the center of attention. Teachers loved him, neighbors adored him, relatives constantly praised him. My parents treated him like he was destined for greatness, and maybe that was part of the problem. When people spend years telling someone they're special, eventually they start believing the world owes them something. Matthew believed that. Everything came easily to him. And because everything came easily, he rarely appreciated it. I noticed it long before anyone else did, but nobody listened when I pointed it out. They never did. By my senior year of high school, college dominated every conversation in our house. My guidance counselor believed I had a strong chance of receiving admission offers from several respected universities. She encouraged me constantly. One afternoon, after reviewing my application essays, she smiled and said something I'll never forget. "Olivia, you're going to do amazing things." It was such a simple statement. Yet hearing someone believe in me felt almost foreign. I carried those words with me for months, especially during the difficult days. Especially during the nights when I studied until 2 in the morning. Especially when I wondered whether all this effort would matter. Then the acceptance letters began arriving. The first arrived in March, then another, and another. Soon I had several offers. Some included partial scholarships. One included a surprisingly generous academic grant. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future beyond my parents' expectations. A future I built myself. A future where my potential mattered. A future where I wasn't simply Matthew's younger sister. The day everything changed started like any other. It was a Saturday morning. Rain tapped gently against the kitchen windows. My father sat reading the newspaper. My mother prepared coffee. Matthew scrolled through his phone, and I walked into the room carrying two envelopes. One was my acceptance package. The other contained financial aid information. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from excitement. I had worked for this moment for years. I thought my family would be proud. I thought they would celebrate with me. I thought I was finally about to be seen. I was wrong, very wrong. My father listened quietly while I explained the scholarship offer. My mother nodded occasionally. Matthew barely looked up. When I finished speaking, silence settled over the room. At first, I assumed they were processing the information. Then my father cleared his throat. "That's impressive." The words sounded strangely empty, like an obligation rather than genuine praise. Still, I smiled. "Thank you." He folded the papers neatly. Then he placed them on the table. "Let's talk about Matthew first." The excitement inside me immediately faded. My brother's acceptance package sat beside mine. Unlike me, he had received very little financial aid. The tuition costs were enormous, yet my father didn't hesitate, not even for a second. "We'll cover it," Matthew grinned. My mother smiled proudly, my father nodded. "We'll take care of everything." Just like that, no discussion, no concerns, no financial worries, no hesitation, everything would be paid, dorm expenses. Books, housing, tuition, every dollar. I remember feeling happy for him. Despite everything, I genuinely did. He was my brother, I wanted him to succeed. But then I asked the question that changed my life. "What about my tuition?" The room became quiet. My father's expression shifted. My mother's smile disappeared. And suddenly I felt like I had asked something inappropriate. My father leaned back in his chair. "Your situation is different," I frowned. "Different how?" Nobody answered immediately. The silence felt heavier with every passing second. Finally, my mother spoke. "You already received scholarship money. Only part of it." Another silence. Then my father said the words that would follow me for years. Words I would hear every time I doubted myself. Words I would remember every time I wanted to quit. Words that would eventually become the fuel behind everything I accomplished. "Olivia," he said calmly, "you don't need to spend years chasing degrees." I stared at him, certain I had misunderstood. "What?" he sighed as though explaining something obvious. "You're a smart girl," I waited, "but eventually you'll get married." I felt my stomach drop. My mother nodded. "As long as you find a good husband, you'll be fine." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. I honestly thought they were joking, but nobody laughed, nobody smiled, nobody corrected the statement. They meant every word. I looked toward Matthew. He said nothing, not one word, not a single objection, not even surprise, because to him this conversation made perfect sense. His future deserved investment. Mine didn't. The realization hurt more than I can describe. I had spent years trying to prove my worth. Years. And in less than 60 seconds, my parents revealed how little any of it mattered. My grades didn't matter. My achievements didn't matter. My sacrifices didn't matter. Because in their eyes, I wasn't a future professional. I wasn't a future leader. I wasn't a future success story. I was simply a daughter. A daughter expected to build her life around someone else's success. I remember standing up slowly. My chair scraped against the floor. Nobody stopped me. Nobody apologized. Nobody reconsidered. I walked upstairs and locked myself in my room. Then I cried harder than I had cried in years. Not because of the money. People often misunderstand that part. It was never about the money. It was about belief. My parents believed in Matthew's future. They invested in it, protected it, supported it, but they looked at me and saw something less valuable, something temporary. Something replaceable. That realization shattered something inside me, and yet, it also created something new, something stronger. Because later that night, while staring at the ceiling through swollen eyes, I made a promise to myself. A promise nobody else heard. A promise that would shape the next decade of my life. If nobody was willing to invest in my future, I would invest in it myself. If nobody believed in me, I would believe in myself. And if my family had already decided what I was capable of, I would spend the rest of my life proving them wrong. What I didn't know then was that this promise would eventually lead me somewhere none of us expected, including Matthew, including my parents, and especially me. Part 2. Building a future alone. For the first few weeks after that conversation, I tried convincing myself it didn't matter. I told myself plenty of students paid their own way through college. I told myself independence would make me stronger. I told myself I didn't need anyone's help. But late at night, when the house was quiet and nobody could see me, the truth hurt. Because no matter how hard I tried to act strong, I couldn't ignore one simple fact. My parents had made a choice. And that choice wasn't based on grades. It wasn't based on effort. It wasn't based on potential. It was based on who I was. Matthew was their investment. I was their backup plan. That summer felt like a countdown. Every day brought us closer to college, closer to the moment when our paths would separate completely. My parents spent thousands preparing Matthew for his new life. There were shopping trips, furniture purchases, electronics, new clothes, dorm decorations. Every week seemed to involve another expense, and every expense was treated like an exciting family event. My mother spent hours helping him choose bedding. My father researched laptops. Relatives called to congratulate him. Meanwhile, I spent my evenings calculating how many hours I would need to work each week just to afford textbooks. Nobody offered help. Nobody asked how I planned to manage. Nobody seemed concerned. One evening, while my parents discussed Matthew's dorm room, I quietly mentioned that I might need a second job. My father barely looked up. "That's life." That was it. 2 words, "That's life." The same man who had spent nearly $3,000 furnishing Matthew's dorm room couldn't spare a few minutes to discuss how I would pay for classes. I stopped bringing it up after that. There was no point, the decision had already been made. By August, Matthew was ready for college. The entire family gathered to help him move. Aunts, uncles, cousins, even neighbors stopped by. It felt less like moving day and more like a celebration. Everyone hugged him. Everyone wished him luck. Everyone talked about his bright future. I stood quietly in the background carrying boxes. At one point, one of my relatives turned toward me. "So what are your plans, Olivia?" Before I could answer, my mother smiled. "Oh, she's figuring things out. Figuring things out." As if years of planning meant nothing. As if my future were some vague idea instead of something I had worked toward for years. I smiled politely, but inside, something hardened. That phrase stayed with me. Because while everyone believed Matthew was building a future, they assumed I was merely waiting for one. 3 weeks later, I moved into a tiny apartment shared with 2 other students. Unlike Matthew's comfortable dorm, our apartment was old and crowded. The kitchen's sink leaked. The heating system barely worked. The walls were thin enough to hear every conversation. But it was mine, and for the first time in my life, I felt something unexpected. Freedom, no comparisons. No favoritism. No constant reminders that someone else mattered more. Just me, my goals, my future, and the responsibility to make it happen. Reality arrived quickly. Within the first month, I learned how expensive independence truly was. Rent, utilities, books, transportation, food. There was always another bill waiting. I found a job at a coffee shop near campus. Every morning, I woke up before sunrise. While most students slept, I served coffee to commuters rushing toward work. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting in class trying to stay awake. After lectures, I studied. After studying, I worked another shift. Then I repeated the process again the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. It was exhausting. There were moments when I felt completely overwhelmed. Moments when I wondered whether my parents were right. Moments when giving up seemed easier. But then something would happen. A good grade. A compliment from a professor. A successful presentation. A reminder that I belonged there. And suddenly the struggle felt worthwhile again. During my second semester, I received an email from one of my professors. She wanted to meet with me. At first, I assumed something was wrong. Instead, when I arrived at her office, she smiled warmly. "Olivia, your work has been exceptional." I still remember hearing those words. Exceptional. Nobody in my family had ever used that word to describe me. She encouraged me to apply for a competitive internship program. Apparently, she believed I had real potential. I left her office feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time since leaving home, someone saw what I was capable of. Someone believed in me, and that belief mattered more than she probably realized. Meanwhile, Matthew seemed to be living a completely different life. His social media accounts were filled with parties, football games, weekend trips, restaurants, concerts, photos with friends. Every phone call home sounded like an adventure. Every family conversation revolved around his experiences. Whenever I visited home, I noticed the same pattern. My parents asked Matthew endless questions. How were his classes? How were his friends? What were his plans? What opportunities was he exploring? Then they turned to me. "Everything okay?" That was usually the extent of their curiosity. Everything okay? Not what are your goals, not how are your classes, not how are you managing, just everything okay. As though my life existed in the background of someone else's story. At first, it hurt. Then it motivated me. Every dismissal became fuel. Every overlooked achievement became motivation. Every moment of favoritism strengthened my determination. I stopped seeking recognition. I stopped expecting praise. I stopped hoping my family would suddenly change. Instead, I focused entirely on my future. And slowly, my hard work began paying off. By junior year, I had earned multiple academic awards. I secured a prestigious internship. I built relationships with professors who genuinely supported me. My confidence grew. For the first time, I wasn't merely surviving. I was succeeding. But what hurt most wasn't my parents. It was Matthew, because unlike them, he knew exactly what I had sacrificed. He knew how hard I worked. He knew how many jobs I balanced. He knew how often I struggled financially. Yet he never once spoke up. Never once. He accepted every advantage without question, every dollar, every opportunity, every bit of support. And whenever people praised him, he never corrected them. Never mentioned how differently we had been treated. Never acknowledged the truth. That realization stayed with me, because betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from people who simply choose silence. People who benefit from unfairness and decide it's easier not to notice. People who watch you struggle and look away. Then came my senior year. The year everything should have felt rewarding. Instead, it brought one final heartbreak. Graduation. The moment I had dreamed about for years. The moment I had worked toward through exhaustion, stress, and sacrifice. The moment I wanted my family to witness. I called my parents weeks in advance. I sent invitations. I shared schedules. I made sure they had every detail. My mother promised they would be there. My father said they wouldn't miss it. I believed them. I shouldn't have. 3 days before graduation, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice sounded hesitant. "Sweetheart, something came up." The moment I heard those words, I just knew. Matthew had been invited to a networking event several states away. An event my parents suddenly considered important. More important than my graduation. More important than watching their daughter receive the degree they once claimed she didn't need. I sat silently while she explained. I don't remember most of what she said, only how empty I felt afterward. When the call ended, I stared at the wall for a long time. Then I cried. Not because they weren't coming, because deep down I had expected it, and somehow that hurt even more. Graduation day arrived. I walked across the stage alone. No parents, no family. No cheering section, just me. As I accepted my diploma, I looked out at the audience. Families were standing, taking pictures, celebrating, and for a brief moment I felt completely alone. Then something happened. One of my professors stood up, then another, then another. Several faculty members began applauding, not because they were obligated to, because they knew my story. Because they knew how hard I had worked. And in that moment, I realized something important. Family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes it's defined by the people who choose to believe in you. The people who show up, the people who see your value even when others don't. As I left the stage holding my diploma, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not complete peace. Not yet. But enough, because despite everything, I had done it. Alone, and deep down I knew this was only the beginning. What I didn't know was that the next chapter of my life would bring opportunities my family never imagined. Opportunities that would eventually force them to see me differently. Whether they wanted to or not. If someone had told me on graduation day that the hardest part of my journey was already behind me, I probably wouldn't have believed them. Because at 22 years old, standing outside the university auditorium with my diploma in my hands, I didn't feel successful. I felt exhausted. For years, my life had been a cycle of classes, work shifts, deadlines, bills, and constant uncertainty. While many graduates celebrated with family dinners and expensive vacations, I spent my graduation evening eating takeout alone in my apartment. Not because I wanted to. Because everyone else had somewhere else to be. My parents were traveling with Matthew. My relatives were busy. Most of my friends were celebrating with their own families. So that night, I sat beside my apartment window, looking at the city lights, and asked myself a simple question. Now what? For the first time in years, there wasn't a clear answer. College was over. The dream I had spent years chasing had finally become reality. And yet, instead of feeling complete, I felt like I was standing at the bottom of an entirely new mountain. Because having a degree wasn't the finish line, it was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise and started applying for jobs, hundreds of them. Every position remotely connected to my field, every opportunity that might help me build a future. At first, rejection became a regular part of my routine. Some companies never responded. Others sent polite emails thanking me for applying. A few offered interviews but ultimately selected more experienced candidates. Weeks turned into months. My savings slowly disappeared. The pressure grew heavier every day. There were moments when fear began creeping into my thoughts. What if my parents had been right? What if all those sacrifices hadn't been worth it? What if I had spent years chasing something that would never truly change my life? Those thoughts appeared more often than I'd like to admit. But every time they did, I remembered that kitchen table. I remembered being told I didn't need a degree, and somehow that memory always pushed me forward. Eventually, my persistence paid off. A growing financial consulting company in Chicago offered me an entry-level analyst position. The salary wasn't impressive. The office wasn't glamorous. The workload was intimidating. But it was an opportunity, and I accepted immediately. On my first day, I arrived nearly an hour early. I wore the most professional outfit I owned. I carried a notebook filled with goals. And as I stood outside the building, I made another promise to myself. No one would outwork me. No one. Inside, I quickly discovered something important. Many people wanted success. Very few people were willing to sacrifice for it. Some employees arrived late. Others complained constantly. Many treated the job as nothing more than a paycheck. I couldn't afford that mindset. Not after everything I'd endured to get there. So I became the person who volunteered for difficult projects. The person who stayed late. The person who asked questions. The person who took responsibility when others avoided it. Months passed. Then years. Slowly, people began noticing. Managers started trusting me with larger accounts. Clients requested me specifically. Senior executives remembered my name. For the first time in my professional life, recognition wasn't something I had to chase. It arrived naturally. Because results are difficult to ignore, even when people want to. Meanwhile, life back home remained surprisingly unchanged. Every family gathering still revolved around Matthew. Every holiday still featured conversations about his future. Every celebration still treated him like the family's greatest achievement. At first, I found it frustrating. Then I found it almost amusing, because nobody seemed aware of how much had changed. While they continued viewing me as the struggling younger sister, my life was quietly moving in a completely different direction. The gap between perception and reality grew larger every year. One Thanksgiving, I returned home after receiving a significant promotion. It was the biggest accomplishment of my career so far. I had spent months leading a major project that generated impressive results for the company. My supervisor personally recommended me for advancement. I was proud of myself, not because of the title. Because of what it represented, proof that my sacrifices had meant something, proof that I was capable, proof that I belonged. During dinner, one of my uncles asked how work was going. Before I could answer, my mother smiled politely. "Oh, Olivia is always busy." Then the conversation shifted back to Matthew, just like that. The moment disappeared. I sat there quietly, realizing nobody had asked a single follow-up question. Not one. Meanwhile, Matthew spent 20 minutes describing a potential career opportunity that hadn't even happened yet. Everyone listened carefully. Everyone seemed fascinated. And for the first time, I didn't feel hurt. I felt free. Because I no longer needed their validation. That realization changed everything. The less I cared about proving myself to my family, the more successful I became. My focus shifted entirely toward growth, toward building a life I genuinely wanted, toward becoming the person I had always hoped to be. By 26, I had been promoted again. Then again. My salary doubled, then nearly doubled again. I purchased my first home. A beautiful townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, nothing extravagant. But it belonged to me, every wall, every room, every key. Mine. The day I moved in, I stood in the empty living room and cried. Not from sadness, from gratitude. Because years earlier, I had been a college student struggling to afford textbooks. Now I owned a home, a future, a life, and I had built it entirely on my own. No family connections, no financial support, no safety net, just persistence. At the same time, Matthew's life was becoming increasingly complicated. Although my parents rarely discussed details, certain patterns became difficult to ignore. He changed jobs frequently. Promotions never seemed to last. New opportunities appeared and disappeared. Every family gathering included vague explanations. He's looking for something better. He's exploring different options. He just hasn't found the right fit. The excuses sounded familiar. Because for years, people had confused potential with achievement, and eventually, reality catches up. I noticed it before anyone else, not because I wanted him to fail. Because I understood something my parents never did. Success requires more than opportunity. It requires discipline, sacrifice, consistency. And those were qualities Matthew had never been forced to develop. Why would he? Whenever life became difficult, someone rescued him. Whenever mistakes happened, someone explained them away. Whenever consequences appeared, someone protected him. That protection came at a cost nobody recognized until much later. One evening, nearly 5 years after graduation, I received a call from an executive vice president at my company. At first, I assumed it was about a project. Instead, he asked me to attend a private meeting. The following morning, I entered a conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. Several senior leaders sat around the table. The atmosphere felt unusually serious. For a moment, I worried something was wrong. Then the vice president smiled. "Olivia, we've been evaluating candidates for a new leadership role." My heart started racing. The position he described was extraordinary, far beyond anything I had imagined for myself. The promotion would place me among the youngest executives in company history. I listened carefully, trying not to appear overwhelmed. Then he said the words that changed everything. "We believe you're the right person for the job." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The room blurred slightly. Years of sacrifice flashed through my mind. The coffee shop shifts. The missed sleep. The rejection, the loneliness. The graduation ceremony, the apartment, the struggle, all of it. Every single moment had led here. I accepted the position that day. And when I left the building, I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes. Not because I was celebrating, because I was trying to process how far I had come. The girl who had been told to find a husband instead of pursuing a career was now leading teams, managing major accounts, and making decisions that affected an entire company. I had become exactly what my parents never imagined, and the strangest part, they still had no idea, but that was about to change. Because only a few months later, our family would gather for an event that would alter everything. An event where the truth could no longer stay hidden. An event where my parents would finally discover what I had become. And by the end of that night, nothing in our family would ever be the same again. For most of my life, family gatherings followed the same predictable pattern. Someone would ask about Matthew. My parents would proudly discuss his future. Relatives would praise his potential. And I would quietly sit on the sidelines, listening. By then, I was used to it. The disappointment no longer surprised me. What surprised me was how little it affected me anymore. Because while everyone else remained focused on who Matthew might become, I had spent years becoming someone nobody expected. And soon, whether they liked it or not, they were going to find out. It started with a phone call from my mother. I was finishing paperwork in my office when her name appeared on my screen. That alone was unusual. My parents rarely called unless they needed something. I answered anyway. "Hi, Mom." Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Olivia, sweetheart, I have wonderful news." I leaned back in my chair. "What happened?" "Matthew got promoted." I closed my eyes. Of course he did. For a moment, I almost laughed, not because I wasn't happy for him, but because I already knew exactly how the next several minutes would unfold. My mother spent nearly 15 minutes describing the promotion. Every detail, every possibility, every exciting opportunity. By the time she finished, I knew more about Matthew's career than most people knew about their own. Then she finally reached the reason for her call. "We're throwing a celebration." "A celebration? A big one?" I glanced at my calendar. "When?" "3 weeks from Saturday." I already had a feeling where this was going. "We want the whole family there." I smiled politely. "I'll try." "Try?" Her tone immediately changed. "This is important, Olivia." Important. That word stayed with me. Because when I graduated, apparently that hadn't been important. When I received promotions, nobody seemed concerned. When I bought a home, nobody celebrated. But Matthew's promotion. That required a major event. I almost pointed out the irony. Instead, I simply agreed. "Okay, I'll be there." After hanging up, I returned to work. Within minutes, I had completely forgotten about the conversation. At least until something unexpected happened later that week. I received an email from our company's board chairman. He wanted to meet. Immediately. That wasn't unusual anymore. As an executive, meetings with senior leadership happened regularly, but this one felt different. When I entered his office, he smiled warmly. "Olivia, I have exciting news." The phrase sounded familiar. I sat down. "What happened?" He handed me a folder. Inside were documents related to a major acquisition. A company merger worth millions. One of the largest projects our organization had ever undertaken. I carefully reviewed the details. Then I noticed a name. My stomach tightened. I looked up, then back at the folder, then up again. Surely I was misunderstanding something, but I wasn't. The company being acquired was the same company where Matthew worked. I stared at the documents. For several seconds, I couldn't process the coincidence. Out of thousands of businesses, out of countless possibilities, our company was about to acquire my brother's employer. The chairman noticed my expression. "You know them?" I hesitated. "My brother works there." His eyebrows lifted. "Small world." Yes, very small. And suddenly, a celebration that had seemed completely unimportant became very interesting. Over the following weeks, acquisition discussions intensified. Meetings, presentations, negotiations, legal reviews, everything moved quickly. Because of my position, I became one of the key executives overseeing the transition. By the time the family celebration arrived, contracts were nearly finalized. The public announcement was only days away. Most people had no idea, including Matthew, including my parents, including every relative preparing to attend the party. Saturday evening arrived. The event was held at an upscale hotel outside Chicago. When I entered the ballroom, I immediately understood how seriously my parents were taking this. The room was beautiful. Elegant decorations. Professional catering. A large stage, live music, nearly 200 guests. Relatives, friends, former coworkers, business contacts. It looked less like a promotion party and more like a political fundraiser. My father stood near the entrance greeting guests proudly. My mother floated through the room introducing Matthew to everyone she could find. And Matthew, he looked exactly as he always had. Confident, comfortable, certain the spotlight belonged to him. For a while, everything unfolded exactly as expected. People congratulated him. My parents smiled proudly. Stories were shared. Champagne glasses clinked. The evening felt familiar. Until I noticed something interesting. Several senior executives from Matthew's company had arrived. People I recognized from acquisition meetings. They hadn't noticed me yet. But I recognized them immediately. One by one, they entered the ballroom. And suddenly I realized something. Tonight wasn't just a family celebration. It was also becoming a business event. That realization changed everything. About an hour later, dinner began. Guests settled into their seats. The lights dimmed. My father stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. Proud smile on his face. The room became quiet. And then came the speech. The same speech I had been hearing variations of my entire life. My son has always been destined for success. Applause. When he was young, we knew he was special. More applause. He has worked incredibly hard to build his future. Applause again. I sat quietly, listening, watching, feeling strangely calm. Because for the first time, his words no longer had power over me. My father's speech continued for nearly 10 minutes. By the end, Matthew sounded less like a person and more like a legend. Then came the part that caught my attention. My father raised his glass. Matthew represents everything our family hoped for. The room applauded loudly. And for a brief moment, his eyes landed on me. Only for a second. But it was enough. Because I knew exactly what he meant, even if nobody else did. Then something unexpected happened. One of the executives from Matthew's company approached my table. A senior vice president. Someone I had worked closely with for months. He smiled warmly. Olivia. Several nearby relatives looked surprised. I stood to greet him. Before I could say anything, another executive joined us. Then another. Then another. Within minutes, some of the most influential people in the room were gathered around my table. The reactions from my family were immediate. Confusion, curiosity, concern. My mother kept glancing in our direction. My father looked increasingly uncomfortable. Because for the first time all evening, attention had shifted away from Matthew and toward me. One relative finally asked the question everyone seemed to be thinking. "How do all of you know Olivia?" The first executive smiled. "She's one of the most respected leaders in our organization." The table went silent. Then someone laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. The executive continued. "Honestly, we'd be in trouble without her." More silence. I could practically feel my parents staring. The vice president smiled. "She's overseeing one of the most important acquisitions in company history." And suddenly, the entire room felt different. Because for the first time in my life, people weren't discussing who I might become. They were discussing who I already was, and the biggest revelation of the night was still waiting. Because in just a few minutes, a truth my family never saw coming would finally come to light, and when it did, everything would change. For most of my life, I imagined what it would feel like to finally be recognized. I imagined my parents realizing they had underestimated me. I imagined them apologizing. I imagined some dramatic moment where everything suddenly made sense. But as I sat in that ballroom watching confusion spread across their faces, I discovered something unexpected. Recognition didn't feel like victory. It felt like closure. Because by then, I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I had already built the life they said I couldn't. I had already become the person they never believed I could be. The only difference was that now everyone else was beginning to see it too. The vice president continued speaking. Honestly, Olivia has been one of the driving forces behind several major initiatives at our company. The room remained silent. I noticed relatives exchanging glances. People who had known me my entire life suddenly looked as though they were meeting me for the first time. My mother's smile had completely disappeared. My father looked stunned. And Matthew looked uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. One of my uncles finally broke the silence. Wait, Olivia is an executive, the vice president nodded. One of our youngest executives. A murmur spread across the room. Questions began appearing from every direction. How long has she been doing this? What exactly does she manage? When did this happen? The irony almost made me laugh, because nothing had happened suddenly. This wasn't some overnight success story. This was years of work, years of sacrifice, years of determination. The only reason it seemed surprising was because nobody had bothered to ask. For years, they had assumed my life wasn't worth discussing. Now they were shocked to discover they had been wrong. Then the senior vice president from Matthew's company stepped forward. And that was when everything truly changed. He smiled politely. I believe congratulations are in order. Someone asked why. The executive glanced toward me, then toward Matthew. Then back toward the audience. Our company is finalizing a major acquisition. Several business professionals in the room nodded knowingly. Then he continued. And Olivia is one of the executives leading the process. The ballroom became completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. My father slowly turned toward me. His expression looked almost unreal, like someone trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly no longer made sense. Then came the sentence nobody expected, especially Matthew, especially my parents. Technically speaking, the executive said, Olivia will soon become one of the senior leaders overseeing Matthew's company. The silence that followed felt endless. My mother blinked repeatedly. My father's face lost all color. Several relatives openly stared, and Matthew, for the first time in his life, he looked small, not because I wanted him to. Not because I was trying to embarrass him, but because reality had finally entered the room. For years, everyone had talked about his future, while ignoring mine. Now the truth stood directly in front of them, and there was nowhere left to look away. The remainder of the evening felt surreal. People kept approaching me, asking questions, congratulating me, expressing admiration. Many seemed genuinely shocked, others seemed embarrassed. A few appeared guilty, as if they were suddenly remembering all the times they had overlooked me. Then my father approached, alone. For several seconds neither of us spoke. He looked older than I remembered, tired, uncertain. Finally, he said something I never expected to hear. We didn't know. I studied his face. Part of me wanted to respond immediately. Another part wanted to remain silent. Eventually, I spoke. That's true. His expression softened slightly. Then I continued. But you never asked. The words landed harder than I intended. Because they were true, they never asked. Not when I graduated, not when I earned promotions. Not when I bought my home, not when I became an executive, not once. My father lowered his eyes, and for the first time in my life I saw regret, real regret, not defensiveness, not excuses, regret. A few minutes later, my mother joined us. Tears filled her eyes. Olivia! I could tell she wanted to say many things, years' worth of things, but some conversations arrived too late. Not because forgiveness is impossible, because time cannot be returned. Eventually, she whispered something that surprised me. We should have believed in you. I didn't know how to respond. Because part of me had waited years to hear those words. Yet now that they had finally arrived, they felt different. Smaller somehow, not meaningless, just late, very late. The evening eventually came to an end. Guests began leaving. The ballroom slowly emptied, and for the first time all night, I found myself standing alone with Matthew. For years, I had imagined this conversation too. The confrontation, the argument, the release of all the resentment I had carried. Instead, something unexpected happened. Neither of us seemed interested in fighting. Matthew stared at the floor, then finally spoke. "You know, I always knew." I looked at him carefully. "What do you mean?" His laugh sounded bitter. "I knew they treated us differently." The admission caught me off guard. He continued, "I just never said anything." There it was, the truth, not hatred, not cruelty, cowardice, silence. The kind of silence that protects unfairness because speaking feels inconvenient. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I nodded. "I know." Because I did know. I had known for years. He looked up. "I'm sorry." And strangely enough, I believed him, not because the apology fixed everything, because it sounded honest. The first honest thing either of us had said about our childhood in years. A week later, the acquisition became public. News articles were published. Industry publications discussed the deal. Business networks covered the announcement. And suddenly everyone knew. Friends, relatives, former classmates, former teachers, people who hadn't spoken to me in years reached out. Some wanted advice. Some wanted connections. Some simply wanted to congratulate me. Life moved forward, as it always does. Months later, my parents visited my townhouse for the first time. I watched them walk through rooms they never helped pay for, rooms built from opportunities they never believed I needed. My father stopped in the home office. Awards lined the shelves. Professional certifications filled the walls. Photographs documented years of accomplishments. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he quietly asked, "Did you do all of this yourself?" I smiled. Not out of pride, not out of revenge, just truth. "Yes." His eyes filled with emotion. And in that moment, I think he finally understood, not my success, my journey, the years he missed. The sacrifices he never saw. The strength he never recognized. The daughter he never truly knew. Today, as I tell this story, I am 34 years old. I lead teams across multiple states. I mentor young professionals. I own a home I love. And perhaps most importantly, I no longer measure my worth through other people's approval. Not my parents', not my brother's, not anyone's. Because the greatest lesson I learned wasn't about success. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about self-worth. Sometimes the people who underestimate you are the very people who should believe in you most. And when that happens, you have two choices. You can spend your life trying to convince them. Or you can spend your life becoming the person they never imagined. I chose the second path. And looking back now, I'm grateful I did. Because the greatest revenge was never humiliating my family. The greatest revenge was building a life so meaningful, so successful, and so completely my own that their doubts no longer mattered. My parents paid for my brother's future, but I built mine. And in the end, that made all the difference.